Welcome to Chataway, the Chapman weekly talk show, where we discuss hot political topics, culture, and life. I'm your host, Tyler Hardigan, and today we'll be discussing the United States-China trade negotiation. Let's meet today's panel. We have Emma, Maddie, Lakpa, and Paulina. All panel members are currently Chapman University students that are enrolled in Intercultural Communication with Professor Jai. Before we get into our questions, let me give you a brief summary on our topic. According to bookking.edu, President Trump launched the trade war to pressure Beijing into implementing significant changes to aspects of economic system that facilitated unfair Chinese trade practice, including forcing technology transfers, limited market access, intellectual property theft, and subsidized to state-owned enterprise. Now out to our first question. The first question goes out to Maddie. Maddie, please explain a bit between the United States and China's relationship. Take it away, Maddie.
The United States and China are the world leading powers in terms of size of their economies, defense budget, and global greenhouse gas emissions. China's presence in the United States grew when China became a member of the World Trade Organization, also known as WTO, during the time of the U.S. economy growing. It is important to remember that China's economy still thrives despite increasing trade tensions. China accounted for almost 50% of the global growth and continues to constitute some of 30% of global prospects today.
Thank you so much for your response, Maddie. Now, a similar question goes out to Lakpa. How would you characterize the U.S.-China relationship?
The U.S.-China relationship is one of the most complex bilateral relationships for the United States. For the past 30 years, Sino-American relations have undergone an impressive transformation from animosity and conflict to candid dialogue and constructive cooperation. These two complicated countries have found common ground on issues of trade, investment, and more recently, security.
Please continue and tell us how the tensions between the U.S. and China originally formed.
When Trump got into office, he sought to engage Beijing directly to address structural concerns about China's economic policies. Just 3 months into his administration, he met with the Chinese leader at Mar-a-Lago, where they agreed to establish a 100-day action plan to resolve trade differences. The next month, China agreed to open its economy to U.S. firms and services in exchange for greater Chinese access on bilateral trade and U.S. recognition for China's Belt and Road Initiative. However, negotiations became tense when Washington pushed Beijing for more concessions and Beijing rejected American pressure.
Great response, Lakpa. Now, going off that, Emma, can you tell me what industries are impacted by the trade war between China and the United States?
Trade war between China and the U.S., or more specifically, the tariffs and trade regulations put in place, impacted major industries like steel and aluminum, food and agriculture, energy, and even shipping across all levels.
Now, going off your last question, Emma, are people outside the industry generally aware of the negative impacts of these tariffs?
Unfortunately, the media was plagued with inaccuracies as to what our position in the trade war actually was, and more troubling was often these messages came directly from Trump and his administration. There were constant statements that assured the public we were winning the war when actually anyone aware of its impact knew that we were not.
Thank you. Next is Paulina. What was President Trump's standpoint on trade with China before even stepping foot in office?
President Trump was very quick to foreshadow his policies with China. He was adamant about his suspicion of China stealing American trade secrets and wanted to use his presidential power to remedy trade disputes with the use of tariffs. He was able to keep his word and impose such tariffs once he stepped into office. Yet he was not able to get the World Trade Organization on board with bringing trade cases against China.
Maddie, how did the perception of China worsen in the United States?
During the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump pledged to challenge America's entire free trade pact. President Trump introduced in 2017 the National Security Strategy, when China was termed America's strategic rival and even adversary. Americans saw China as the opponent of the U.S., the enemy they were battling against. The U.S. was trying to keep the trading system under wraps from China so that China can't decide whether the actions of Washington are to maintain an organized trade system or the intention of keeping them in an inferior position of power and status. China is thinking at this time, are they trying to keep trade under control, or are they trying to keep us under their authority instead of cooperating in a trade effort? It turned into an us versus them mentality. American attitude towards China have become less positive over the years. Overall, 38% of Americans have a favorable opinion of China, down from 44% in 2017.
Maddie, going off your last question, how did the trade tensions escalate to spark the trade war?
On Trump's inauguration day, he announced the U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which many saw as an Obama legacy, and pledged to renegotiate NAFTA, a Clinton legacy. As the Chinese sides began to explore areas of trade compromise because the U.S. stopped ties with the industries, the White House undermined its stated plan. Dialogue fell apart, and Trump signed a trade measure that unleashed a trade war by spring 2018. In April 2018, the Trump administration introduced its first trade threats. In mid-June and late August followed the 25% tariff on $34 billion and $16 billion of Chinese exports. China took retaliations on the tariffs on U.S. exports, which resulted in the U.S.-China trade war entering a more serious phase. The early impact of China's tariffs on U.S. exports is likely to prove greater than that of U.S. tariffs on China's exports. $50 billion represents 38% of U.S. exports to China, but only 10% of China's exports to the United States. There is no winner in the trade war. The ultimate objective of Trump's administration seems to be targeted at America's deficit partners, in particular, China, Mexico, Japan, and Germany. The tariffs against commodities or services were set up in first place by Trump's administration's agenda. The ultimate target was technology innovation and intellectual property rights.
That's a great answer, Maddie. Now, Lakpa, what was the reason for the start of the trade war?
President Trump launched the trade war to pressure Beijing to implement significant changes to aspects of its economic system that facilitate unfair Chinese trade practices, including forced technology transfer, limited market access, intellectual property theft, and subsidies to state-owned enterprises. Trump's 2016 presidential campaign was to reform the U.S.-China trade relationship, in which it pledged to cut a better deal with China that helped American businesses and workers. Trump laid out a 4-part plan to secure a better deal with China for the U.S.
Thank you so much for your response, Lakpa. And now the next question goes out to Paulina. Paulina, many refer to Trump's approach towards trade with China as two-pronged. Can you please elaborate on the meaning behind this statement?
The first prong was the idea of tearing down the bilateral or multilateral form of engagement with China and the trade with China, which President Trump did by pulling the U.S. out of the TPP agreement and negotiations. The second prong was the implementation of the new board policies that made it more costly and practically impossible for the two countries to trade certain products.
Thank you, Paulina, for clarifying that statement for me and the rest of the group. Emma, what was the initial goal of Trump's tariffs on China?
Well, the goal of these 232 tariffs, which targeted steel and aluminum, was to aid in revamping the industry in the U.S. It was deemed necessary to combat the decline of the industry due to China's production dominance and control over global pricing. Initially, the imposition of 10% tariffs on aluminum and 25% tariffs on steel did positively impact the industry. However, the eventual problem was overcapacity of steel, which led to depressed prices and a necessary change in operations.
Going off Emma's question, Paulina, could you please tell me what contributed to such an escalation of relationships between the two countries?
The Trump administration continued to escalate the issue with the implementation of new tariffs in the announcement of the Phase 1 agreement. Nothing comparable with trade has ever happened before, yet nobody was ever able to stop the president. The importance of intercultural communication played a crucial role due to the use of Twitter by the president. Presidential tweets differed largely from the White House announcements, which also differed from the policy implementations as well.
Great answer, Paulina. This next question goes out to Lakpa. What was the purpose of tariffs?
President Trump has advocated for greater trade protection and imposed a series of tariffs on China, Mexico, Canada, the European Union, and other trading partners. Trump's administration justified these policies on 3 grounds. The first one was that they would benefit American workers, especially in manufacturing. The second was that they would give the United States leverage to renegotiate trade agreements with other countries. And the third was that they were necessary to protect American national security.
Going off your last question, Lakpa, please also answer if China relies on the U.S. more, or does the U.S. rely on China more?
Donald Trump has caused a rapidly escalating trade war with China, threatening an additional $100 billion of tariffs on top of the initial $50 billion. In doing so, the Trump administration is failing to appreciate a crucial reality. The United States needs China more than China needs the U.S. The U.S. depends heavily on China for providing the low-cost goods that enable income-constrained American consumers to make ends meet. The U.S. also depends on China to support its own exports. Next to Mexico and Canada, China is America's third largest and by far its most rapidly growing major export market, and the U.S. depends on China to provide funding for its budget deficits.
Thank you, Lakpa. Now, Emma, how did China respond to these tariffs and regulations? What makes it a trade war?
China fired back in response to the tariffs on aluminum and steel by placing heavy tariffs on U.S. food and agricultural industries. Additionally, these tariffs led to deals and meetings being canceled industry-wide as China no longer wanted to purchase these U.S. products in fear of it appearing to be in support of the U.S. protectionist policies. The soybean industry was the most detrimentally affected as China was their biggest consumer, and they had turned to Canada and Brazil in light of the tariffs.